Welcome to OsteoBites. My name is Christina Iptoma, and I am mom to OsteoAngel Dylan and the Director of Scientific Programs for MIB Agents. Today on OsteoBites, we are talking with Elena Gerasimov of Kids v. Cancer. Elena will be discussing compassionate use of investigational drugs, and she'll give us an overview of the Compassionate Use Program, explain how to apply for experimental drugs, and discuss the resources available to both patients and doctors throughout the application process. And today we have Junior Advisory Board members Mia Sandino and Camille Wall as our panelists. So I am very excited to have Elena with us today on OsteoBites. Elena is Program Director at Kids v. Cancer, a nonprofit pediatric cancer advocacy organization. She directs the Compassionate Use Navigator program, providing guidance and personal assistance to physicians and families in applying for experimental drugs. Previously, Elena worked as a science and business journalist and as a program manager. She holds a Master of Public Health degree in maternal and child health and an MA degree in journalism. And I know from personal experience, accessing investigational drugs can be really confusing and it can be a really daunting process. And Elena and Kids v. Cancer have so much expertise in this area, and they offer tremendous resources for both patients and physicians trying to navigate this process. So we are very excited to have her here today to explain how this all works, especially for a rare disease like osteosarcoma, where there are very few approved drug options. Before we get started, I have a few events that I wanted to share with you all. For those of you in the Boston area, we have a Boston Mingle coming up next Friday, March 31st. We promise it's going to be fun, and there's going to be free drinks and appetizers, and everyone in the osteosarcoma community is invited. We'll put the invitation and registration link in the chat, and please share with everyone you know in the Boston area. And while we're there, we're also hosting a Healing Hearts retreat for bereaved osteosarcoma patients on April 1st. Please email Casey. We'll put her email in the chat too, and she will reach out to you with more information. And we'd like to thank the sponsor of this episode, BTG Specialty Pharmaceuticals. BTG provides rescue medicines typically used in emergency rooms and intensive care units to treat patients for whom there are limited treatment options. They're dedicated to delivering quality medicines that make a real difference to patients and their families through the development, manufacture, and commercialization of pharmaceutical products. Their current portfolio of the antidotes counteracts certain snake venoms and the toxicity associated with some heart and cancer medications. The drug Veraxase is for high-dose methotrexate toxicity. All right, Mia, would you start the introductions, please?
I would love to. Hi, my name is Mia Sandino. I am an osteo warrior. I'm also the Vice President of the Junior Advisory Board for MIB. I'm very honored to be here and welcome everybody, and I'm excited for this great presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Camille Wall. I'm 19 years old. I'm currently living in Boston, Massachusetts, and I'm a freshman at Boston University studying education and human development. I am a 7-time osteo warrior and a member of MIB's Junior Advisory Board. Happy to be here. And I'll turn it over to Elena.
Hello, I'm Elena Gerasimov. I'm very glad to meet you all. And I think that it will be an interesting topic for both audiences, for the patients, for their families, and for healthcare providers if they're joining us as well. The topic of my presentation today is compassionate use of investigational drugs for kids with cancer. So the Kids v. Cancer is a nonprofit pediatric advocacy organization. It was founded in 2009 by Nancy Goodman after her son Jacob passed away from brain cancer. Jacob was 10 years old. Since then, Kids v. Cancer has championed 2 federal laws, the Creating Hope Act and the Race for Children Act. And we are currently advocating for passage of a 3rd bill, the Give Kids a Chance Act. This new bill will give FDA authority to request studies of combination of drugs for children with cancer. When Jacob was sick, Nancy applied to 8 companies seeking compassionate use for him. None got back to her. So in 2016, we created a Compassionate Use Navigator to help physicians and families understand the process and apply for drugs. We have today in the audience both patient families and healthcare providers. So I'd like to state that while only healthcare providers can submit applications, it is very important for patient families to understand the process so that they can initiate conversation about compassionate use with their doctors. The Compassionate Use Navigator was inspired by the story of Josh Hardy. I would like to offer you to read it. It's available on our website, and I provide here a link for that. So when we created the Compassionate Use Navigator, we were aiming at overcoming informational barriers. We found that some patients do not know about this option, that there were misconceptions about FDA not allowing the request to proceed, and that there was an inequality in ability to access the drugs, meaning that only people with connections or those who were computer savvy were able to research the drug programs and to apply for them. So I list here a few barriers and a few quotes for you about the goals which we set to overcome. So I think I'll start with the definition of compassionate use. Compassionate use refers to treatment with unapproved therapies, meaning drugs not approved by the FDA, for a patient who is refractory or relapsed and not responding to standard therapy. FDA has established several criteria to define and grant access to experimental drugs. According to this criteria, compassionate use is intended for a patient who has an immediately life-threatening condition or serious disease and cannot wait for a therapy's approval. There should be no comparable or satisfactory alternative therapies available, and if a therapy exists, it must be no longer effective. The primary goal of compassionate use is treatment, not research, unlike it could be in a clinical trial. So the best way to access experimental drugs, those which are not on the market yet, is through enrollment in a clinical trial. But patients are often ineligible or cannot relocate in order to participate in a trial. And sometimes trial is not recruiting or has ended, or eligibility criteria may exclude children and adolescents due to their age. In this situation, a patient may consider applying for compassionate use. Compassionate use can also be sought for pediatric cancer patients when off-label use of an FDA-approved drugs is not covered by insurance. We're seeing more and more situations like that now. Here on the slide, you can see a few examples that we worked with based on an insurance denial to cover those drugs. An important consideration is regulatory requirements that the benefit of an experimental drug must outweigh the risks. And the assessment of that is done by treating physician and will be reviewed by FDA later. So I want to say a few words to set the correct terminology. Patient advocates, physicians, academics, and journalists usually use the words experimental or investigative drugs, or obviously compassionate use. FDA and many pharma companies refer to compassionate use as expanded access. Another widely used term, pre-approval access, precisely describes that the drug has not been approved yet. In Europe, common terms can include named patient program and early access. If you read literature, you might run into those terms. And single patient IND, or investigational new drug, is the application that the company files with FDA for compassionate use for a single patient. And this term is also used to describe compassionate use, something like to open single patient IND. Separately, there are also expanded access programs for multiple patients offered by drug makers. Also, the term has the word expanded access, just like FDA when it refers to compassionate use. These programs are different from compassionate use because they are intended for multiple patients, usually have specific eligibility criteria, and are often listed on clinicaltrials.gov. These programs can be offered as a transition for patients after a trial has ended and before a drug is approved. Enrollment in those programs might not be possible for a child whose medical history does not meet eligibility criteria or due to the patient's age. So somewhat like a clinical trial, it is expanded access, but it can have its own criteria in order to join that program, which basically brings a patient who doesn't qualify for it back to square one. So in those cases, physician will still seek a single patient compassionate use, even in situations when the drug company has an open expanded access program. How do patients find compassionate use drugs? Before an application for a compassionate use drug can be submitted to FDA or to a drug manufacturer, a physician needs to identify the drug that has a potential to help patient. I call it step 0. Here, there are several ways how patients and doctors can learn about experimental drugs. For patients, it's very often through the word of mouth, through patient organizations, through research on the internet, or they would hear from their physician who would initiate conversation about compassionate use. For the providers, for healthcare providers to find compassionate use drugs, they need to be familiar with the ongoing clinical trials. They can hear from colleagues. They can see what's in the drugs company's pipelines on the manufacturer's website, or they peruse other websites such as PubMed. After they have identified the potential compassionate use drug, there are 3 steps in a process to apply for the access to that drug. The first one is to apply to drug manufacturer. Then the application would need to be submitted to the Food and Drug Administration, and the physician will need to receive approval from its IRB. So to apply to a drug manufacturer, you will need to find contact information for the company, first of all. You can try locating the expanded access link on the company's website if you don't have company's contact. Most larger companies have posted information with an email address and a phone number, or they might have an online form which you will need to fill out if you want to apply for the drug. If you are contacting the company by email, you should include in your correspondence an indication and a brief clinical history of the patient. The history should include data such as the patient age, gender, weight, allergies, diagnosis, prior therapy, response to the prior therapy, and the reason for your request, including an explanation of why the patient lacks other therapeutic options. There might be several back and forth communications, or a company might want to speak with you on the phone. If the company agrees to provide the drug, it will issue you a letter of authorization. You will need to submit the IND number given in that letter of authorization together with the letter of authorization to the FDA. I will explain in a little more detail later in the presentation. There is a link here to the sample letter of authorization. The initial, yes.
Sorry, Elena, is this step, the applying to the drug manufacturers, is that something that the physician has to do or that the patient can do?
The whole process of applying to compassionate use can be done only by a physician.
Okay.
So the patients, of course, are welcome to write to the drug manufacturer, and sometimes those letters are helpful as a support, especially if a company issues a denial. But the official request for access to a drug must be submitted by a physician. It's in a free format. It's just in physician's own words. I have such and such patients. The patient relapse. Here is the, the agent. This and this. This is why I believe that the drug you have would be helpful. So just a letter. And sometimes there are specific questions, especially if it's an email form on the drug manufacturer's website. They will ask for what they want. If there is nothing but just the email address, for instance, then it's basically a letter.
Okay, and I think on your website you have some examples, right? Some templates?
We do. We did provide sample letters, yes.
Great.
So the initial time commitment for a physician would be about 1 hour. It's my estimate to find the contact information and to write an email with a brief clinical history. The companies also usually post the response time, the anticipated response times that they'll get back to a physician within 5 days or a week. Usually it's something like that. But that's just to get back to initial request. And the issuance of a letter of authorization may take longer. So here I have a drug manufacturer's examples of policies slide. Since the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, the drug manufacturers are required by law to have a policy on compassionate use publicly accessible. So the most difficult step in the whole process is obtaining agreement from a drug company to provide a drug. Companies are under no obligation to provide drugs for compassionate use, and FDA cannot compel a company to do it. So the information the company would post would include how long it will take them to respond to request, contacts, and also criteria for providing the drugs. But not all companies have complied with this requirement. So, if the larger companies might be expected to have this information, some small companies still don't have it. And some have simply posted statements indicating that they do not provide compassionate use access. I have 2 examples here. One company's policy states that due to supply constraints, it cannot grant access. And another company says that the drug will not be available for compassionate use until a phase 2 study is complete. But as a patient advocate, I believe that even when such policies are posted on the website, it is worth contacting the company with a request. We don't know when the phase is completed. I think we should always give it a try. Step 2 is to apply to FDA. It is a good idea to notify the FDA of your request, either before you submit the request or right after. Submit the request to a drug manufacturer, because FDA at this point won't know yet that you're seeking compassionate use. Applying to the Food and Drug Administration involves filling out Form 3926, which is only 3 pages and takes about 5 minutes to complete if you have clinical history in front of you. There are instructions on how to fill out the form on FDA's website. In addition to clinical history, you will need to provide a treatment plan. This will include the planned dose, route, and schedule of administration, planned duration of treatment, monitoring procedures, and planned modification to the treatment plan in the event of toxicity. So the whole process needs to be thought through. It is often useful to reference published studies, if there are any, that have used the drug in a similar manner. Reaching out to peers who have requested compassionate use for a specific drug is also helpful. And you will need to include the letter of authorization, which grants FDA the right to reference the drug's company's IND, so it can review a description of the manufacturing facility and other regulatory data. The response time of FDA in emergencies is it could be immediate, and for oncology patients, it's about 2 to 3 days for non-emergency requests. I would like to stress that FDA has a totally fantastic resource called Project Facilitate. This is a pilot program. I believe it was created a couple of years ago by the Oncology Center of Excellence, and it provides comprehensive support to oncology healthcare professionals in completing expanded access requests. It is essentially a call center which connects you to an FDA officer. FDA will consider scientific likelihood of a drug's benefit in each case and can provide companies' contact information. It will answer your questions and help with the paperwork. And even if you have no questions, it is a good idea to notify Project Facilitate of your upcoming or submitted request. FDA also has an email and a phone number for patients to call and talk about compassionate use. And I encourage families to do that. It's absolutely great resource. You know, I really hope that with the facilitation from FDA, the likelihood of obtaining the compassionate use drugs or following the process in an efficient manner really increases. It's a great resource for us.
I'm just going to insert some props for the FDA here, because just from personal experience, they are amazing to work with. You think it's going to be this large government bureaucratic entity, and it's not at all. Like, you talk to actual people and they're, you know, they know your name, and they're like, well, look for your application. We're going to keep an eye out for it. And they're super responsive. So I just want to give some, you know, feedback that just from my personal experience, they've been amazing to work with.
Absolutely, I agree. You know, I think they're very responsive and they want to make it happen. And actually, I had cases when FDA officer would review the application and say, you know what, we can suggest a different drug, which might be also on a compassionate use basis, but they have a wealth of information on their position. They know what's going on, what drugs are in development, and it's a great resource. This slide, I have FDA mailing addresses where the documents need to be sent, and I tried to make a screenshot of the form 3926 here in the bottom. There are different addresses for biologics and for the drugs. All of that information could be found on FDA website, but I just wanted to call attention to it. So the last step, the third step, is the IRB review and informed consent. After the drug manufacturer agrees to provide the drug, the application to FDA and the IRB approval, they can be initiated simultaneously. In non-emergency cases, the FDA will need to see the IRB approval before the start of the treatment. You will first need to obtain informed consent from the patient and then a sign-off from the IRB chair or other member of an IRB. A link to sample informed consent is provided here. And I also want to say that the full IRB committee meeting is no longer necessary. It's not necessary to wait, you know, a month for the whole committee to meet. You will just need to contact the IRB chair or another member if the chair is not available, and request sign-off on your request. And please ask for help from your clinical research staff in arranging the sign-off. After all of these steps are completed, the investigational drug will be shipped directly to the physician who is responsible for overseeing the investigational treatment and reporting the outcomes to the sponsor IRB and the FDA. In a rare instance, since most children are being treated in academic centers, which obviously have IRBs, in a rare instance, if the request comes from a practice where there is no IRB, we provide some resources how to find an independent IRB. You know, and we estimate the time frame for about an hour to obtain the informed consent and about an hour to locate the the chair of an RB and get a signature. You notice that I mentioned several times emergency and non-emergency situations. So emergency is defined by FDA when it's an urgent need for treatment and there is no time to waste. The original case of Josh Hardy that I referenced earlier was an emergency case. Josh was a cancer patient. He had a kidney cancer since he was very little, and he beat it 3 times. And then he needed to have a bone marrow transplant. And after the bone marrow, he got an infection with adenovirus. And his compassionate use request was actually for medication to beat the adenovirus. He was dying from that. So that was an emergency case, literally. In emergency, you need to call FDA. FDA usually grants emergency use requests the same day over the phone. There's no paperwork. There's certain paperwork can be submitted later. You can proceed quickly. You will send the paperwork which is required after the treatment has started within 15 days of treatment initiation. And the same applies when there is not sufficient time to secure IRB review prior to treatment. You may proceed just after obtaining informed consent that is required. And then the IRB must be notified within 5 working days of emergency use. There is a separate phone line to contact FDA when you are requesting emergency use, and they also work after hours. So that's a good resource to know about. Family expectations for compassionate use. So patients cannot submit compassionate use requests themselves. This leads to an expectation that the physician will be on board and will pursue the request. One study of pediatric oncologists found that in 73% of cases, conversations about compassionate use were initiated by a healthcare provider. So that the doctor alerted the family that there is such an option. But many families are very knowledgeable about drug development and about what's on the market. And most are willing to do everything in their power to obtain a therapy they believe might save or prolong a child's life. Unfortunately, often companies deny compassionate use requests. There have been numerous cases, instances of families fighting the denial of a compassionate use drug. That was a case of Josh Hardy, when social media and television and journalists and Congress people were involved in trying to get the drug for Josh. And that I believe that Josh's case gave it was a start of the compassionate use movement in the patient advocacy community. Families now send pleas to drug companies. They create energetic social media campaigns. They seek help from politicians, from celebrities. They offer to pay for an investigational drug. That was also an offer that the company received when the drug for Josh was requested. The advocate said, like, well, is it all about the costs? We will cover the costs. Or, I know about the cases when families try to buy a drug from an overseas pharmacy if it's available there. And this is why, because families are willing to fight like that, this is why it is encouraging for the family when a provider becomes a family's advocate. As an example, I'd like to read you an excerpt from an actual email exchange, a letter an oncologist sent in response to a drug company denying his request. So here it is. I know the reality. The family most definitely knows the reality of this disease, And I know that this may not work or do anything for the patient, but all we ask is for a chance. In conclusion, I hope you all can understand where the family is coming from. I will continue to support them, especially the patient, during this process, and will advise them the best I know how, but I cannot and will not tell them to stop continuing to fight. Physician considerations for compassionate use. Families look to their pediatric oncologist for direction and emotional and medical support. At the same time, physicians must balance uncertainty about the potential benefits and toxicities of a drug against risks of the disease itself. Some physicians may be reluctant to engage in discussions about compassionate use. The reasons for this may be inability to identify a promising investigational drug, concerns about unproven effectiveness or potential toxicities of the drug, lack of clinical evidence to justify investigational treatment for a specific indication, or safety concerns related to the condition of a patient. Because the compassionate use application requires knowledge of the regulations and the administrative process, there have been instances when an oncologist who has never submitted a request is intimidated by the unfamiliar process and the presumed time commitment. So we encourage the doctors to educate themselves or seek assistance from organizations that provide it, from the FDA, and research the investigational drugs and advocate for their patients. In terms of for the assistance for physicians and families, this slide about our Compassionate Use Navigator. Kids with Cancer created the Navigator program before Project Facilitate was initiated by FDA. We work directly with families and have experience with denials. We can explain the process, locate drug manufacturers' contact information, provide templates, and help draft initial requests to drug manufacturers. We can help with Form 3926, although we obviously do not have access to clinical information of the patient, and we can answer questions. My contact information is on this slide. Another resource is another organization that provides assistance is the Reagan Udall Foundation for the FDA. They provide guidance on expanded access to physicians and patients. On their website, there is an explanation of the application process, including a link to clinical trials. That will include those expanded access programs for multiple patients that I mentioned in the beginning when I explained the terminology. The companies included in the directories that Reagan Udall provides, they submit information themselves, so the directory may not be comprehensive, but it's a very good resource to start. And there is also a link to an electronic submission for non-emergency request to FDA, but that can be as well sent just by email to the FDA. And I provide the contact information for Reagan Udall here. My last slide is about the right to try. I want to say a few words about this. It's federal law. So for decades, the mechanism of expanded access to investigational therapies has been criticized for blocking access to investigational therapies because it was very difficult to get compassionate use. A lot of advocates were not satisfied with how it was working. So as a result of this criticism, right to try laws were passed in many states. And in 2018, a federal right to try law was enacted. Similar to compassionate use, right to try is intended to provide patients with terminal illnesses access to unapproved drugs. So what are the differences? Unlike under the single patient IND, under the Compassionate Use Program through FDA, under the right to try, eligible drugs must have completed phase 1 trial rather than phase 2. So it's earlier in the clinical studies process. Right to try also cut out FDA's oversight from the whole process. FDA does not review or approve requests for Right to Try Act use, because a lot of criticism was coming mistakenly, blaming FDA for not granting the requests. That was not the case, because the first step to receive authorization to use compassionate use drug was always drug manufacturer. So, and also individual Right to Try Act requests do not require IRB review or approval. So both of those steps are cut out. And patients can submit the request themselves rather than going through a physician. So why not to consider this strategy? Because it sounds generally quite good, right? So first of all, Right to Try has not overcome the major obstacle to obtaining access, which is the drug-sponsored denials of compassionate use requests. You still have to ask the manufacturer to provide the drug. Because it does not require drug sponsor to provide an investigational product. Some people say that the Right to Try actually provides only the right to ask. In this regard, it's not different from the existing compassionate use pathway. Some pharmaceutical companies oppose Right to Try, even though it shields them from liability, because companies prefer to proceed with the expanded access mechanism that provides FDA safeguards. They want to know that FDA has reviewed requests, that the FDA agreed on it, authorized it. And there is no reliable data, but a year after Right to Try was enacted, I last looked at it, I believe in 2019, only a handful of patients reportedly received drugs through Right to Try. They can submit requests, but in my experience, it's highly likely that the company will tell them to go through the compassionate use mechanism. So this is how it works, and I thought I will mention that as an option, but I personally have no knowledge of successful requests or of patients using this pathway. So this was my brief overview about compassionate use, and I'd like to thank you, and I will be glad to answer your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. I have a question coming up. So this happened to me as well, because I had to, use some investigational drugs, but I did not go through the compassionate use program. Often drug manufacturers offer a financial assistance program for drugs, which is what I did, that aren't covered by insurance. How is applying for compassionate use different from applying for a discounted price or no-cost drugs from the Drug Manufacturers Foundation or financial assistance program? So how would you compare the two?
It's a very good question. There are several differences. First of all, compassionate use drugs are free. And they would most likely be issued for the condition as a single course of therapy. It wouldn't be an ongoing, it wouldn't be for something chronic. And that would be for the patient who cannot access it some other way. So the financial assistance program for patients usually come because the patients go to those programs because the insurance doesn't cover. That makes me think that most likely the drug has been approved, because if the insurance has the right to consider coverage or support or deny the coverage, that would be for the approved drug. Compassionate use is for the unapproved drugs, those that have not come to the market yet, those which are in a clinical trial. When you're in a clinical trial, the issue of insurance is not rising, So this is, I guess, for the different stages of the drug development. That would be an answer approved versus unapproved drug. And then for the length of the therapy, to some extent, not necessarily, but maybe. But usually the compassionate use drugs will not be even considered by the insurance because insurances exclude all experimental drugs. The drug needs to be approved. Going through the financial assistance program at the company is a very good pathway for those who are fighting the insurance company. And in my experience, companies are quite generous and really trying to help with provide help to patients who cannot afford their drugs otherwise.
Elena, can I just clarify? So when you say an approved drug, because there's just overall FDA approved, but especially for a disease like osteo, a lot of, especially when you're looking at, targeted therapies, a lot of those drugs may be FDA approved, but not for osteo, so they're considered off-label drugs.
Right.
So does the compassionate use apply to off-label drugs? So it may be an FDA approved drug, but not approved for use in osteo.
Right, so it's approved for a different indication, and therefore insurance would decline coverage, correct? Yes, that happens, unfortunately. When the FDA set up compassionate use program, it was not for these purposes. It was not for those circumstances. It was exclusively for people who cannot get it through a clinical trial. That's why, some of the terminology for it, it's still called pre-approval access. Okay. We're talking about before the drug was approved. But I hear about more and more cases when people go through the compassionate use pathway to get the drug because insurance is not covering. And the companies are questioning, themselves. They say like, well, we don't know what to do. The drug is approved. The drug is on the market. The doctor can prescribe it. Why you are applying to compassionate use? That's a loophole in a whole situation. It hasn't been resolved yet. And I think this is something we as a patient advocates need to work on. About coverage of cancer drugs, because waiting for the peer review studies to be published to prove that this indication, so the drug works, for some expanded indications, takes time. And we need to create a mechanism, and now it's actually happened to be a compassionate use, to come and apply for the approved drug just because it's for a different indication. Yes, patients do that.
So people do that, but it wasn't kind of the primary intent.
It was not the primary goal. I think it was not even anticipated that that's what's going to be happening. My guess only could be that we are learning with such a speed, we're discovering, especially with the targeted therapy and precision medicine, we're discovering different genes and mutations on which, the drug could be actually effective against this and this one. And I think it's a result of the recent scientific progress. But yes, we are basically seeing patients asking for compassionate use for approved drugs now as well.
Thank you.
All right, I have the next question based off personal experience that I had. So I was treated with MePAC, also known as MTP, PE, or mifemuritide, in 2017. My family and my physician went through about an 8-month process to obtain it, and I ultimately did receive the treatment. Mifemuritide is widely used in other places outside of the US, but for some reason it's not FDA approved here. So I'm wondering, is the process any different or easier if there are a lot of established precedents of patients with a specific disease applying for a drug?
If there are a lot of patients with specific disease applying for a drug which is not approved in the United States, or for approved drug, that would be, I think, the first distinction. There is a provision which I'm not very familiar with, since it's outside of compassionate use, about personal drug importation from another countries for personal use. This is something that FDA handles, and I guess if the drug is approved in another country and it's needed for a patient here, and for some reason it's not approved here yet, I believe there is a pathway to import the drug. For the multiple patients here applying for the unapproved drug, FDA actually likes to collect this information because it would allow FDA to consider suggesting to a company opening of a new clinical trial. For instance, if you take an example with another indication, that there is a drug which is being studied for one indication, but then, we're seeing more and more patients applying for it to compassionate use because they have a different indication, but they have reasons to believe that the drug is working. That might lead FDA to turn to the company and say, look, we're seeing so many of them, why don't you open a trial? And the trial can be very small. It could be 5 patients, 10 patients to start with, as far as I know, that has happened. Sometimes it even happened within the same hospital. I would talk to an oncologist who said, oh, I have such and such patient, he's looking for this drug. And while we're working on getting this drug, I get a message saying, oh, now I have 2 patients looking for this drug. So I would hope that encourages companies to open more trials and to look into studying the drugs in different indications.
Had another question come in. You had mentioned that the biggest hurdle is getting drug manufacturer approval. Based on your experience and working with patients and their families, what are the best strategies to secure compassionate use approval from the drug manufacturer?
That's an excellent question. It's actually, I would like to talk about that, and I wish I knew the best strategy, but I can tell you what works if that's possible. The best one is a proof that this drug is going to help the patient. So if there were previous instances of this company providing drug to somebody who needed compassionate use and seeing good results, basically saving a patient life or prolonging a patient life, they are more likely to provide it again. So a good justification. I had a case once when the company said, no, they declined to provide the drug for a patient for whom we were advocating. And what helped us, we found a doctor in a different institution across the country who said, you know what, I actually use this drug for my patient. And then we asked him to get on board with the treating physician of our patient and talk to a company together. And when they did that, the company changed their course and provided the drug. I mean, it wasn't like that. It wasn't into one conversation. It wasn't very easy. We didn't locate another physician right away. It all took time. But, I saw that it worked. If we would have stopped at the first denial, the patient probably wouldn't get the drug. But we kept looking, and we found somebody who's done it. So that's very helpful. It has to be some kind of clinical justification that the drug you're asking for has a potential to help. And the company will look at that. In my experience, companies developing the drugs for patients because they want to save lives. So they are not just declining to provide the drug out of, for no reason. There is usually some justification, unless it, as it was in a Josh's case, it was supply issues. It's much harder for smaller companies because they don't have enough drug manufacturer. And but I believe the former head or speaker of the biotechnology industry organization a while ago, several years ago when I was at some conference, told drug companies that if you are developing a cancer drug, you have to prepare yourself for the fact that you will be asked to provide compassionate use. So you just start thinking how you're going to do it at the same time when you're starting to develop the drug. And I think that most of them do, and they create those expanded access programs when they can. So I think we're seeing positive dynamics, at least, from a time when Josh needed a drug, which was in 2014.
All right, I have the next question from the audience. The care teams are so busy and the application process seems like a lot of work and extra administrative work. How can patients and caregivers help their oncologist/care team during the application process? And what types of resources does Kids v. Cancer offer oncologists to ease the burden and help them through the process?
It's also a very good question. We hear it a lot. I try to stress that the time commitment is not so huge, but I don't want to minimize it. From looking for the company's contact and sending some email and summarizing clinical history, yes, it takes oncologists time, absolutely. If there is staff who are able to help with that, that's excellent. Most large academic medical centers do have the staff and they do have experience, but certainly there are doctors who have never submitted that request, who don't have administrative resources to do that. And as I said, FDA can guide, they can help with this form, filling out of the form. We have templates, FDA has templates, how to write the letter to the drug manufacturer. This is just like really an email. You can send even a very short email if you don't have time right away. I wanted to apply such and such drug, I will provide you the clinical information later, just like to initiate the process. I'm more than happy to do that. That's what I've been brought on board to Kids with Cancer to do in 2016. That's when I joined the organization. I can help fill out the form, but not fully, but, I will guide, I will explain. And when you actually, I guess when you're listening to presentation, it seems like, yes, look at that, the drug manufacturers, the FDA, the IRB, and researching the drug, it all takes time. After you've done it, and you know what drug you want, it's not that time consuming. The difficulty will come if you are denied the drug, because you would need to go back and forth. I would encourage every physician to go back and forth with the company, not just take no for an answer on the first try. It doesn't mean that the drug will be provided. It depends on every single case. But yes, it takes advocacy on the part of the physician, and I try to say that I believe this is what the families now expect, that the doctor would be an advocate for a patient. And in my experience, most oncologists are advocates for their patients.
And Elena, to that point, you had given us a nice anecdote about that that instance where you were able to pair up the two doctors, one that had experience, a good outcome with one of the drugs, with the other to help them get approval, which was very encouraging. But I was just curious, do you have a sense of kind of what the success rate is after getting the first denial? Like, is there a pretty encouraging rate once you have that back and forth conversation?
I cannot put a number on that, but here's what I would say. I believe that situation improved dramatically in the past 7 years. That we used to be seeing denials all the time. And as I said, when Nancy first asked for the drug for Jacob, no company even would get back to her because they were not obliged to respond to an email they get. And now they're more or less up, especially those who post those policies, they have people, they will get back to you. That's already was the first big step. And after that, we start about why this drug or why not this drug, and will it help the patient or not, and I believe if there is a medical justification for that and a chance that the drug is going to help, most likely the patient will be provided the drug. That the big social media campaigns that we had to do for Josh, going on CNN and Fox and Friends, that's what, how it actually ended up. Or, enlisting Washington football team player, to tweet all of his supporters of over 1 million people, saying that we need help for Josh. I think this is no longer needed. So I would say that the success rate is increasing. That's what I would say. I'm much more optimistic now, if you would get a compassionate use request than it was in the beginning when I just started working on that.
All right, that's encouraging. Thank you. Mia, do you want to throw out one more question and then before we wrap up?
Sure. What is the typical turnaround time once you contact the drug company for compassionate use to when the patient has the drug in hand, or I guess in the nurse's or oncologist's hand, to start treatment? Is it easy to get an emergency use exception for the 30-day waiting period?
Yes, absolutely. Emergency use does not have a 30-day period. As I said, the FDA would approve it over the phone. You call them at 9 o'clock at night, and if you have an agreement. What is the time frame? Okay, so the company for non-emergency, the company will get back to you within 5 to 7 days. Sometimes it's 2 to 3, depends on the company. After that, depending whether they agreed right away to provide the drug, let's say it will take them another week, going back and forth, they will agree. So that would be 2 weeks. The FDA, after you submit the paperwork, for oncology patients, 2 to 3 days in non-emergency cases. They state that 3 days approval. IRB, depending on how soon you could locate the chair of the IRB, I would say, it could be next day if you prepare the paperwork. Again, if you have a clinical staff who can help fill it out, that just one person doesn't have to do all that. So we can look at a very optimistic scenario of 2 weeks and non-emergency. I would say more likely it would be a month to 2 months, probably, though, because all of the steps would require time. All this paperwork would need to be done. In an emergency, it could be as soon as next day, plus, we need some time for shipment of the drug because the company ships the drug, so it could be, the next day probably is also very optimistic, but like say the day after, for emergency requests, Josh got his drug in a week, but that was through all this pressure and TV interviews and everything. And that was for emergency in a week. So in that case, it was actually, very long because Josh was dying from that virus. So, I would say it's realistically to think a month to 2 months to get the drug, depending on also what the condition of the patient. If it's obvious that the patient can continue on the current therapy, but we want to explore that, based on the results of the current therapies, then, there isn't such a hurry. But, let's say 2 months is a good estimate.
Okay, great. That's also not super long. So I'm sure we could sit here and ask you questions all day because there's it's really good information and super helpful. And we just want to thank you, Elena, for joining us today and for your commitment to pediatric oncology patients everywhere. There's a wealth of information on the Kids Beat Cancer website, so we'll make sure to send out that link so everyone has that. And can share, Elena, can we share some of the information on your slides as well? Because there was a lot of great information.
Absolutely.
There.
I put all these mailing addresses and everything with ideas that slides could be perused afterwards, as a reference.
Great. So we'll share those with everyone who registered today. More information on this and all OsteoBytes can be found on YouTube, our website, mibagents.org, or your favorite podcast place. And next week, we are talking to Dr. Amanda Marinoff from UCSF about MYC amplification as a prognostic biomarker in osteosarcoma. So thank you again, Elena, for being here today, and to Mia and Camille. As always, you guys are awesome. Thank you. And thanks to our sponsor, BTG Specialty Pharmaceuticals. And thank all of you for joining us today. We hope to see you next week. Thank you.